Are we ready for the movie of the week?
Indeed.
Indeed. Alrighty, so what are we talking about this week?
You're a wizard, Harry.
Okay, so we're going to be stirring the cauldron, as it were, this week, as we said last time. Hello, Ash. I see Ash in the chat, and we'll see who else shows up. Yes, but what? Why did we pick this movie? Why would we do this?
Controversy.
Controversy is fun.
We're gluttons for punishment.
Yes. Okay. So, what was your experience? Sort of like, how old were you when Harry Potter sort of burst onto the scene? At least movie wise. I mean, I didn't even know about the books till the movies came out. Maybe it was the same for you.
Yeah. So I did hear about the books first, but it was purely in the negative sense. Um, I grew up in a charismatic church. I think we talked about that once already. Charismatic movement and all of that. And like most Christian backgrounds and not just homes, but church movements, um, there was a good bit of rejection of the Harry Potter franchise. And I do remember, even to the extent, and I don't know if I could give all the information about it, but there was a conference at one point that really like got parents together and church leaders together and how we were going to combat this Harry Potter phenomena. So,
Mhm.
late 90s, early 2000s, it began to rumble around and you hear about it. And I think the first movie came out in 2001, but I was successfully obsessed with Lord of the Rings at that point. So I didn't even have any consideration for Harry Potter,
Trade
but
one wizard for another.
exactly. And that wizard was okay.
Mm-hmm.
But the the others not so much. And so we, fast forward a few years, and I believe it was the Order of the Phoenix, the fifth story in the franchise. And I caught some of it on TV or something. I can't remember where exactly. Maybe it was Blockbuster, and I just finally picked up the DVD. But then I watched all the way through. I went and saw 6, 7, and 8 in the theaters. By the time I got to 7, I was just like fully a fan.
Yep.
Midnight premiere level
Ooh.
fan. And yeah, that's a thing of the past.
Full blown heretic.
Full blown heretic. And then I read through the books, and I mean,
Oh, did you miss it?
what's that?
Blasphemy!
I didn't hear it.
Oh, you can't hear it?
Can't hear it. I already got the heretic or
You got
blasphemy or
two.
whatever.
I was just like, well, hold on a second.
Wow.
If you can't hear it, oh, I know what the problem is. That's one more thing. I'm actually glad I did that because I wouldn't have realized. I'm going to have to switch you over to this. There we go.
There we go.
Now,
Blasphemy!
yes, I was sending you strictly my microphone and not the full stream audio.
Oh, okay.
So that's
Okay.
the problem.
Yeah.
A little behind the scenes in the
definitely,
midst of,
definitely blasphemy there.
yeah.
Yeah. So I mean, I can remember getting into the books. I love the books. Actually, I've read
Mm-hmm.
through them, I think 2 or 3 times now, and yeah, 3 times. And I remember reading through, and I feel like we can throw spoilers out there because
Yes.
the era of spoiler on this movie / book series has come to an end. So here's your warning.
Unless
spoiler.
like we inspire some Christians to get over their legalism,
That's true. That's
and
true.
they go and see it finally. But
spoiler alert. I remember getting to the 6th book. I was reading it in an airport, and like get to the scene with Dumbledore's death, and my jaw hits the ground. And okay, so if you haven't seen it, this is where Harry becomes a frog, and then Gandalf comes in, and then Darth Vader. No, I'm just kidding.
Oh no,
I won't go into much details.
Ash is like, you're gonna spoil it for me. Apparently,
I'll leave every other detail out. We'll say it that way. But I just remember like my jaw hitting the floor, and like I was into it. I was really into it.
Mm-hmm.
But there was definitely a lot of waves.
Okay, so I guess I'll give a little of like my experience of it, and then we can talk about how we justify watching this villainy. Um, so yeah, I told the story a little bit of my first introduction last week when I was talking about how I escaped the cage stage of Calvinism. And Order of the Phoenix was also my first exposure to it, and it had like the themes were so striking to me that it actually gave me some practical insight into how to handle an issue in my life at the time, which was interesting. But it was engaging. Like there's just some like, even if it's not always overt, you can almost feel these deep kind of moral themes going on throughout the course of the movies. And so then after I saw that, eventually, I don't remember when I sat down and finally watched the rest of the movies, but I did. I ended up seeing them through. I think Order of the Phoenix was probably the only one I saw in the theater. I
Okay.
watched a little bit more after that, outside of that, and then eventually at some point I just watched them all the way through. But now I own them in 4K, so hey. And then eventually after that, it was probably only in the last year or two, like a little bit before my daughter was born, I would spend evenings or whatever playing Minecraft and sitting and listening. And then I, of course, could listen on commutes. And so I didn't read them physically. I listened to them, but they were unabridged, so I think it counts. But and so
I'd say so.
and I realized, yeah, they capture the story well. I think I feel like the movies, I've tried to describe how well they've adapted them. It's like a lot happens in the movies and they fit a lot. What's interesting about it is it's almost like they didn't necessarily take anything out, but you don't see necessarily everything that's happening unless you've read the books. Like there's little glimpses of things that
Right.
happen and you understand the full significance of it if you've read the books. But there's nothing that's necessarily, cut out like it didn't happen, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
I think at worst there were points where like it felt like the story was moving at such a speed that it felt like they were going through the motions of the book because they had to, maybe. I don't know. That's like a vague complaint, and it was more of a feeling. But for the most part, I think they really like the acting was consistently good, and they got the emotions, I think, of the book and the characters and the stuff like nailed in the movie, which I think is kind of what matters the most. Almost, do you feel the way you feel watching it the same way? Do you feel the same way you did when you read it? And I think for the most part, that tends to be the case.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent summary of that because, having compared the books and the movies, and I've read the books through a couple more times than you, but it's not a contest. But I did win. But
What did you do better than me? Sorry, I missed it.
I read them more.
Yeah.
I
Yep.
mean, but it's not a contest. But, yeah.
It's not a contest, but if it was, I won.
But if it was.
But if it was,
But yeah, I think I think the feeling of it is mostly what's captured, and it's captured well. And the acting is excellent. They did a great job making them into films.
Mhm.
Obviously, there's certain things that if you read through the books, you're like, oh, I wish that was in the movie.
Yep.
Not that they did a horrible injustice by omitting, but there's just certain things you're like, oh man, I really wish that was in there because that would have been cool to see.
Yeah, it's interesting. It was more so than Lord of the Rings, I think, is that you can, again, if you've read it, it's not like it's not there, like it couldn't have happened. But
Right.
like for my, probably the best example would be like Dumbledore's backstory. It's
Yeah.
pretty much gone in the movies,
Right.
but there's like hints. If you know
Mhm.
like what this one portrait means and like this comment by this character, it like references it oh so subtly. So it's like, oh,
Yeah.
I know what that means, but it's not like the story is saying this didn't happen,
Yeah.
But yeah, there's a lot of that.
Yeah. Perhaps more Dobby would be all that.
Oh,
I
the
would have
whole
asked
the
for.
whole slave revolt thing.
Yeah. But it's not like you said, it's not like it didn't happen. It's just they didn't focus on that for the films.
Right. Okay, so how do you justify your blasphemy in watching these and reading these? And I say you because I mean, like,
Yeah.
it's not like I've engaged this at all. But
Yeah, so it has been presented as a challenge in the sense that people have challenged me on it.
Mhm.
I don't know if I've ever answered it sufficiently, but the way that I came to processing even feeling the liberty to watch it was really just kind of coming to an understanding of what liberty was and the fact that I do have the liberty to partake of such a thing.
Mhm.
Um, I think that honestly, there was a little curiosity as well. I
Yeah,
wanted to see.
not to flip this on its head, but I almost want to ask the question this way. What movies what I mean, maybe you could give specific examples,
Mhm.
but in principle, what kind of movie, or maybe what movies, uh, would you say you don't feel free to watch?
Mm,
Um, and why doesn't Harry, and like things that might relate theme wise to Harry Potter?
yeah,
And what makes Harry Potter not fit that qualification?
interesting. Yeah, I mean, I guess I do think that there are movies that I would abstain from watching.
Hmm.
Um, some are more personal reasons. Some are maybe perhaps I would maybe say it in a way that it has no benefit to me as a believer.
Hmm.
Um, there are lots of movies out there with gratuitous nudity and sexual content that it just has no benefit for me as a believer or as a person in general. Like it has no benefit to me. So
Hmm.
those are things that I should probably keep my distance from. Um, there's also for me on a personal level, I've never handled like scary movies well, and that is a wide gamut. It's not just the most like supernatural thriller horror movies. I always feel like I pronounce that word wrong, so I try to avoid it. The paranormal type stuff, I usually abstain from just because I will have vivid nightmares, and so I've just always stayed away from it.
Hmm.
But that, like I said, that's more of a personal, not so much of a not so much of a spiritual like, oh, I feel sinful because I watched The Ring.
Uh-huh.
Um, I just was scared out of my mind. So, and that's not even that scary of a movie in comparison. But yeah, I guess those are the categories that I really just kind of feel like I need to stay away from.
Hmm.
The reason why I think that Harry Potter for me jumped from the must abstain from to the now I have liberty to partake is um, the curiosity level. I think that got me to give it a shot and then discovering like, oh wow. Um, first of all, the majority of what I had been told about it was not necessarily true. And at the same time, discovering, wow, here's a really great story that is using themes, and we've talked about this a little bit already, some themes that um, are types and shadows of our Christian faith. That's not me trying to Christianize Harry Potter. I just think there's some themes that run true in the greater story
Yeah, it's not us
that,
trying. It's the author's
yeah,
self description of her work.
yeah,
Yeah.
it's glimpses into the greater story,
Hmm.
and yeah, I think that's very clear in there.
Hmm.
Um, maybe a helpful note in that. Now I have a daughter. She's about to turn 8 years old,
Hmm.
and that was one of the questions that Chanel, my wife, and I had about that was like, when do we feel liberty to allow her to watch it, if at all?
Hmm.
And so we kind of decided on an age range for that. And some of it is subjective. We want to see where she's at. Um, not yet, but there will be a day when we probably feel that there's enough liberty where she could watch it, she could handle it.
Hmm.
Um, but there was a waiting game with that to wait and see. So, is it for everyone? No, and I think it's an issue of conscience. And for me,
Hmm.
I felt liberty in my conscience to watch it,
So,
and I'm
yeah,
glad I did.
yeah. So Steelman, you ever heard of steel manning?
Mm-mm.
It's the opposite of straw manning.
Oh,
Okay. So it's when you state your opponent's argument in a way they would be satisfied with. Uh, steel man the position of someone who says you should not watch Harry Potter.
Ooh, I feel like this is one I could probably be pretty extreme in and still capture at least a subsection of people.
Uh-huh.
Um, the most common thing that I heard was that, this is witchcraft
Hmm.
and therefore has no place in the life of a believer, to the extreme of saying that this was kind of like a gateway drug into witchcraft.
Yep.
And what was going to happen, the devil's scheme
Hmm.
in this was to use this as a gateway in for young minds to be captivated into witchcraft. And out of it would be um, thousands, if not millions, of young people becoming worshipers of Satan.
Why is that not true?
Number one, I think that was never that was never the intent of the author.
So do you
And
think that's kind of one of the major issues? I mean, this is me stating what I think. Is that not like one of the major, I think, problems I think both of us have with Christian criticism of culture is
yeah,
not so much that we shouldn't criticize culture, but that we don't care about authorial intent. Like,
yeah, no, absolutely.
mhm,
Um, and because of that, we often kind of pin our opinions of their intent to them, and so we create these evil people who I'm not going to say never are that way, because certainly there's probably been some times when the church has gotten it accurate.
mhm,
But in this case, I don't think that was the case. I really don't believe that to be the case. And I also think another layer of that, and this is something that I've always struggled with, is so often the fear of Christendom um, is this, like, I'm going to catch the devil, like it's a cold, like
mhm,
he's a cold, by seeing something or engaging in something. So there's a
mhm,
hesitancy to ever engage with anything that might be out there in culture.
mhm.
And yet then I will see some try to justify it in other ways. So it's like this one thing.
Oh no, sorry, you're cutting out just a little bit.
But then, you know,
Might want to say
did
the
I?
last
Okay. So,
sentence.
am I back?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay. So we have people who justify, um, oh, we'll watch this or we'll partake of that, but not something like Harry Potter, because that's too far. Um, but it's kind of the same thing, really, when you break it down. If one is evil, then the other has to be evil. You
Yeah.
you can't you can't just automatically pin one as outright evil and the other as not. And I'm being very vague, I know, but
Yeah, no, and
I,
I think for me, uh that's sort of the 1-2 punch response I have is one, uh I mean, there has to be I think there's a positive response you could give defending it and a negative in that there is the hypocrisy of many Christians who criticize it
mhm,
because they have embraced fictional works that are more overtly Christian, but with this magic symbolism. So there's clearly
mm,
wizards, witches, magic, evil creatures, and stuff in Lord of the Rings, I guess, but Narnia. Narnia
yeah,
is more overtly allegorical, and Christians are more conscious of that. So I think that's part of the disconnect. Um, whereas they're not aware of the authorial intent, or haven't been for a long time, of uh, Harry Potter. Um, and so there's that pointing out of hypocrisy, which I think is important, but that shouldn't be all we do, because I mean, maybe it's all wrong. Maybe we shouldn't read Narnia either. Maybe
mm,
we shouldn't read Tolkien either because of this symbolism. Like, you can't just point out the hypocrisy, because all you're saying is, well, you're doing the same thing. You have to show in
yeah,
principle why it's actually good, you know. And so I think, yes, I think, like, so I guess that would justify, like, could you describe maybe and I don't know, maybe you haven't thought it through as much. I'm still thinking it through myself. I think I have some vague answers that are really satisfying to me. But what is the difference between, like, the magic and the themes that you see in Harry Potter and, like, the things condemned in Scripture? and why, or if they're not different, why is that okay?
Yeah. One of the ways that I have reckoned with it, I guess, is one of the ways that I reckon with Lord of the Rings or Narnia.
Mm-hmm.
There is a fictional world. There's a magical world for the purpose of the story. It's a created universe for the sake of the story. Um, and so for me, and I guess that does kind of reveal a little bit of where I feel the liberty for these things. That's enough for me to understand like that what I'm dealing with is a fictional work, and there's liberty for me to be able to pick up and enjoy and whatever. But because it's a fictional world and not necessarily dealing with real world, although one could argue such things,
Mm-hmm.
um, I think that I'm able to say, yeah, this is okay. This isn't crossing any of these lines. And I also think, black magic, white magic, all this stuff. Like, I don't know. I don't know really the grand theological answer to that all, other than to say, I think that as long as one feels liberty to partake in it and it's not a violation of conscience, they should be able to do so by faith.
Mm-hmm.
And um, we practice a principle of reject, redeem, and I knew I was going to forget the third right when I launched into it.
Reject, redeem,
And accept.
uh-huh.
I just went out there.
Yeah, just
Receive, accept.
Mhm.
If you're going for all R's, it's receive.
Mm-hmm.
And so for me, I think Harry Potter falls somewhere in the middle of redeem and receive. I'm able by faith to receive it, and I think there is a redemptive story in it that's able to tell me some wonderful things. Falls into the grand story, and I'm able to see some principles that I can apply to my faith. Um, there are also things though that are out there culturally that are just outright rejected, and we already talked about a couple of those things,
Mm-hmm.
but um, I have found that I am able to receive this and not have an issue there, but I can definitely understand why others don't.
Mm-hmm.
I probably didn't answer your question.
Yeah, I guess I could give my swing at an answer in that. Now this is an area. Now I've already gotten a comment on Twitter of someone who's very upset with my Doug Wilson fanhood. I don't care, just for those of you who would complain, but he's the. I'm not going to talk about. I get frustrated with that conversation, but I won't get. I won't get into why right now. But he's done very well. He says one of the most influential theologians in his life was C.S. Lewis. But Wilson's done a good job talking about thinking about the spiritual realm and the vocabulary we use. He made an interesting point looking at the Old Testament. He's like, does the Bible use the word magic? I'm trying to remember. It uses like sorcery. It uses various terms, but he basically says magic is just interaction with the spiritual world. Okay. So you can actually say practicing spiritual gifts in the biblical sense is magic in a sense. But it's condoned and gifted from God, right? But then what we generally consider to be sorcery and evil magic, like things we see in the Old Testament, is an engagement with the spiritual realm that hijacks the will of God and what God condones. And so now take that over to a fictional work where they use this terminology. Like you pointed out, this is a fictional world, but it's an entire world, right?
Mm-hmm.
There's like, so in Narnia, like the deity, like if you want to be really legalistic, I could see a Christian going over to Narnia and saying, look, there's a different deity in this world, so therefore it's promoting idolatry. Well, no, it's a set of rules, a set of characters. It's this created world with its own rules, but these are rules, according to Lewis, that parallel intentionally Christianity, right? And so I think you could take that over to Harry Potter and say, it's both it's maybe one of the things that makes Christians go is that it takes place in England. It's not like Narnia. Narnia takes place in England and then Narnia, but Harry Potter's all supposedly in the real world, and they talk about magic and things like that. But it's still fictional in regard to the world of magic. It's not like it is something wholly different than what you would see in scripture as the things that are condemned. It's this fictional version of these powers and things like that. But not only that, it is also allegorical of Christian themes. And so in that sense, you could say it's fake magic, fictional magic, but it's also allegorically paralleling good magic, Christian magic, if that makes any sense, in the way like Doug Wilson talks about. And not only that, I suppose that's a good segue in that what are the Christian themes in Harry Potter that we know are there, not by accident, not forced, like you talked about redeeming culture. I agree with that. But I think there's an abused version of that, in that like a Christian might watch a fictional work where overtly you can tell the directors, writers have a pretty anti-Christian agenda. But we're like, oh, but I want to like it, so I'm going to substitute this character and for me say it's an allegory of Christ, even though I know I'm being attacked, basically. So for me, that's not good redeeming of culture. I think even in that case, even in a case like that, I think you could justify a Christian watching it for the sake of critique and understanding, as a challenge to sharpen their faith, but you can't redeem it when the attention is so overtly against you. And so with Harry Potter, for me, it's like why it's closer to the receive part is that it actually has intentional parallels to my beliefs, but it's not perfect. So there's that like redeem aspect to it, but so for you, what pops out to you? Some of the themes are obvious, but Christianity wise.
So I may be cutting in and out. A couple times while you were talking, it kind of froze up for half a second. So
saw that. We'll see how
I
it
apologize.
goes.
I apologize in advance if I get frozen.
Yeah.
Initially, I mean, the obvious one is, you've got the sacrificial hero who lays his life down on behalf of his friends. Out of love for his friends, he's willing to sacrifice himself to lay down his life so that they would live. And, I mean, that is a very obvious parallel to the sacrificial death of Jesus Christ. And I think as well throughout the story, I've picked up several instances of, I don't know, just little scenes even, not even like the whole theme of things, but just little scenes here and there that have been encouraging to me. One of my favorite is actually from Order of the Phoenix. There's this scene, I love it in the movie, where one of the characters, Luna, has a conversation with Harry, and Harry's going through the worst of the worst here. He feels separated from everybody, isolated, and he's undergoing these intense attacks by the enemy Voldemort. And
it is amazing, like some of the sorry, you're cutting out, so I'm talking, but no, it is amazing some of the ways that they parallel.
Ironically,
yeah,
it cut right like when I paused too, so
it worked. Yeah, but no, I was gonna say they it is remarkable the way in which I found like Harry Potter's like mental battles against Voldemort very much parallel, at least almost in the charismatic world sense, what spiritual warfare looks like. It was very interesting.
Yeah. But the thing that in that conversation that stood out to me is Luna says to Harry, like, essentially telling him, like, it's not really that surprising that this is the way that Voldemort is attacking you, because I would think if I were the enemy, that's what I would want. I would want to separate you from everybody and get to you that way.
Yeah.
And that scene has always just like hit me, like the importance of community, the importance of the church, because that is exactly one of the tactics that the devil uses, is to try to isolate believers, to cut us off from each other. And in doing so, he's often able to fight. And like you said, through the mind. And that's often one of the ways that the devil fights us. That's the main way he fights us. And so
Yeah.
um
And
that's what
speaking,
he's doing in all that.
it gets kind of meta, you might say, if
Yeah.
that's the right word. In that, like you talked about the view Christians often have about why Harry Potter or something like it might be dangerous, and that there's almost like this osmosis kind of view. If I watch it, the demon will float out of the screen. And it's like even if I'm not consciously believing a bad thing or doing a bad thing, like it's just gonna like you often hear like there's a spirit attached to that. There's a whole vocabulary kind of that it has no biblical grounding as far as I can tell. Like I in this other video I made on my other channel, like I did kind of want to be fair to it, and like I've heard weird stories that I'm not sure what to feel about in terms of like, you know, cursed objects or something in Africa where they've met witch doctors or whatever, like where maybe there's this unconscious contact with the demonic realm. But like again, with to me, like even if there's some validity to that kind of thing, when it comes to something like this where there's no motivation like that from the author, and there is actually in a positive sense an actual motivation stemming from Christianity in some sense, even though we could talk about probably the problematic agendas and beliefs of the author politically or whatever. There's still, I don't think that's what was put in the movie. Like what was put in the movie was consciously built on much more historical Christian themes. There is like, yeah, I got halfway through the thought, but I think I'm making my point. But there's that conscious theme being put into it, and an absence of that evil intention. And yet Christians still think that there's this unconscious, like spiritual world that can just attach itself to you in spite of what's even intended. And so, yeah, it's like there's so many theological presuppositions that were built kind of into the satanic panic era, that were never even expounded upon, you know. But,
I would say I think there's insufficient evidence to make that argument, and yet I've heard that argument so often. You know, on very many different topics. I mean, I can remember, you know, especially in that same era. I like what you call it. What'd you call it? The Satanic Panic?
That's not original with me by any stretch, but it was a thing. Like it related to, like it preceded us even. I think there might have been some of it in the 70s, definitely the 80s, 90s. It was what impacted things like Dungeons and Dragons, Pokemon, anime, a lot of these things.
Music as well, like
definitely, yeah, of course.
You know how many great albums were set on fire at bonfires. That, you know, maybe in my early days I would have celebrated the burning of such albums. Now I'm like, oh man, there's probably some great music that went up in flames.
Yeah, I remember one pastor joking about that. He's like, I want that Metallica album, give it to me. Why throw that? I mean, yeah, interesting. Okay. Any other themes that pop out to you? Like trying to think of the portrayal of Voldemort, the portrayal of Potter. Like some of it's like so overt, but what struck me about some of it, it's more of a feeling thing. Did you ever watch Breaking Bad?
I haven't, though I've been told I need to.
Yeah, I would recommend it with caution. I had a friend who was very upset that Christians were recommending it, and he had a valid point in that it contains some of the things that you mentioned. There's like, you can watch. I would recommend, like, if you want an abundance of caution, use like the TV versions if you can find them. But like in the first episode and in an episode later in the series, there's nudity, but then that's it for the whole series. For some people, that disqualifies an entire show. If that's your principle, I respect it, but it can be avoided. And therefore, that aside, the show has incredible writing in terms of exploring the psychology of becoming a horrendous person. And the way I felt the themes explored in Harry Potter, it just reminds me of Breaking Bad in the sense that, in the way it explores how a person struggling to do good experiences emotion and how evil comes about and the motivations behind evil.
Yeah.
The backstory of Voldemort is fascinating.
Yeah,
Um,
absolutely.
yeah. Uh, in Breaking Bad, you see Walter White basically disintegrating from like this guy you thought you respected as this chemistry teacher who's a dad who has cancer, but you see that seed of pride take root, and by the end,
Mhm.
he's an absolute, psychopath. But it's so well written that you follow him the whole show, and like people,
Hmm.
people like it's so well written that like you relate to his decisions, even though objectively he is literally becoming incredibly evil.
Yeah.
Um, it's not quite that way with Harry Potter. They definitely have like a more straight up villain at the beginning
Yeah.
with
Yeah.
no you feel no sympathy, but then you slowly gain some by the end, at least some understanding of
Yeah.
it.
Well, I think even that is maybe a theme that runs throughout it is coming to understand um, the forces of evil,
Yep.
um, and its nature, and in doing so, that's one of the ways that Harry is actually able to overcome because what he discovers about evil, especially in the sixth book and matching the sixth movie, although the book does much deeper work on it, is Harry doesn't necessarily become totally compassionate for his enemy,
Yep.
but he understands it to the point where he's able to flip it, and where Voldemort is operating with a lack of love, Harry realizes the key element to victory over his enemy is the one thing he absolutely lacks, which is love. So
Mm-hmm.
it's like, by understanding the evil and understanding the wickedness of Voldemort's heart, he's able to accomplish the thing that he needs to accomplish um,
Mm-hmm.
through sacrifice and love.
Yeah, that does harken back a little bit to what jumped out to me last when I talked about last week. Escaping the cage stage was that the more Harry like gives into his anger over being uh marginalized and
Yeah.
misunderstood and fought against by the those in authority, like the more vulnerable he becomes to Voldemort, and then he realizes once he puts that aside, and he actually I mean, I don't know if it's worded the same way in the book, but in the Order of the Phoenix, the movie, he's like, actually I feel sorry for you. Like, I
Yeah.
don't know if I don't know if Christians are called to feel sorry for Satan. That's not quite the lesson I think we should take from it. But the at the very least, I think recognizing the potential for our own fall, the way
Yeah.
that Satan fell, the root of pride instead of love for God.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, yeah, that connects quite a bit.
Maybe a more obscure theme that just popped into my mind is with Jesus, you had a substantial amount of following that eventually dropped off because they realized as Messiah, he wasn't quite the Messiah that they envisioned.
Yep.
And with Harry, there's this not substantial following, but there's this sense that he's already rid the world of Voldemort, and Voldemort will never return, and yet then Voldemort returns, and then they kind of begin to expect once the Wizarding world accepts this that what will triumph is some grand battle or something like that, and yet again sacrifice is actually the way of victory here. So
Mhm.
again, it's the idea that victory looks different in the sense that it's not going to come through some great work of um, political power or something like that. Some great rise of um, an emperor or something like that. It's going to come through the lowliest of the lowly, and it's going to come through sacrifice.
Mhm. Yeah, and from there, I mean, we could talk about the end, but it would almost be too spoilery. But like, suffice to say, at that point, particularly towards the end, it's almost like beat for beat
Yeah.
biblical imagery and everything.
Yeah.
But
Resurrection
hey,
and
hey,
yeah.
hey.
Oops. Oops. Oh, I didn't say who gets resurrected.
Oh yeah, yeah. It's Voldemort. No,
Obviously.
no. Kind of. Well,
In a way.
you know. All right. Any more thoughts on there? We're about 42 minutes in. Solid discussion on Harry Potter. Any final thoughts on there before we do a little Harry Potter quiz?
Yeah, I mean, I guess, over the course of the conversation, it's kind of, I guess, sparked a little bit into why I should maybe have a little bit more of a theological response to why
Hmm.
I feel it's okay.
Yeah.
I've pointed to liberty, and I do feel that liberty is sufficient enough of an argument.
Hmm.
Um, we're not supposed to spy out each other's liberty. We're not supposed to attempt to put anyone under bondage in commanding people's conscience.
Uh-huh.
Um, for the sake of love, I could definitely lay down Harry Potter,
Hmm.
if that was needed.
Yep.
Um, not I don't say that boastfully. I'm just saying, it's not so important to me that I couldn't lay it down.
Hmm.
But at the same time, from the opposite side, we need to understand what the scriptures are saying and not command others' conscience on the issue. So I'm not forcing anybody to watch it. I
Hmm.
think if you do feel liberty to do so, I would encourage you to watch it because it's a good story.
Hmm.
It's enjoyable. But if you just can't, then don't.
Hmm. Yeah, yeah. I guess I do try to pursue that like theological uh justification, at least to some extent, because I don't know, just because I have seen people, I don't think you're doing it, but I have seen people use that liberty response like uh to justify some things where it's a little more overtly an issue that I think more Christians would probably agree on.
Yeah.
um and so like I don't know, I want if there's a negative, like, look, you're being hypocritical here, we should point that out, but like having the positive, is helpful. In that yeah, yeah. And so yeah, that's more why I take the route that I do.
Yeah.
um yeah, there was a second half to that thought. I hate when this happens. It's happening Friday nights we do this at the end of work, and the brain's
Yeah.
not running on, not burning on all cylinders, but
Well, and we both got little ones, and
yes.
you just by the end of the week you feel the weight of
Hmm.
that.
Yep, yep, yep.